guys, this is Cozy Book Babe and we are back with the Assassin's Blade. In the last video we finished up with the Assassin and the Pirate Lord. So we're starting with chapter 1 of The Assassin and the Healer. The strange young woman had been staying at the White Pig Inn for 2 days now and had hardly spoken to anyone save for Nolan, who had taken one look at her fine night-dark clothes and bent over backward to accommodate her. He gave her the best room at the Pig, the room he only offered to patrons he intended to bleed dry, and didn't seem at all bothered by the heavy hood the young woman wore or the assortment of weapons that gleamed along her long, lean body. Not when she tossed him a gold coin with a casual flick of her gloved fingers. Not when she was wearing an ornate gold brooch with a ruby the size of a robin's egg. Then again, Nolan was never really afraid of anyone, unless they seemed likely not to pay him, and even then it was anger and greed, not fear, that won out. Irene Towers had been watching the young woman from the safety of the taproom bar. Watching, if only because the stranger was young and unaccompanied and sat at the back table with such stillness that it was impossible not to look, not to wonder. Irene hadn't seen her face yet, though she'd caught a glimpse every now and then of a golden braid glinting from the depths of her black hood. In any other city, the White Pig Inn would likely be considered the lowest of the low as far as luxury and cleanliness were concerned. But here in Inish, a port town so small it wasn't on most maps, it was considered the finest. Irene glanced at the mug she was currently cleaning and tried not to wince. She did her best to keep the bar and taproom clean, to serve the Pig's patrons. Most of them sailors or merchants or mercenaries, who often thought she was up for purchase as well, with a smile. But Nolan still watered down the wine, still washed the sheets only when there was no denying the presence of lice and fleas, and sometimes used whatever meat could be found in the back alley for their daily stew. Irene had been working here for a year now, 11 months longer than she had intended, and the White Pig still sickened her. Considering that she could stomach almost anything, a fact that allowed both Nolan and Jessa to demand she clean up the most disgusting messes of their patrons, that was really saying something. The stranger at the back table lifted her head, signaling with a gloved finger for Irene to bring another ale. For someone who didn't seem older than 20, the young woman drank an ungodly amount of wine, ale, whatever Nolan bade Irene bring over, but never seemed to lose herself to it. It was impossible to tell with that heavy hood, though. These past 2 nights she'd merely stalked back to her room with a feline grace, not stumbling over herself like most of the patrons on their way out after last call. Irene quickly poured ale into the mug she'd just been drying and set it on a tray. She added a glass of water and some more bread, since the girl hadn't touched the stew she'd been given for dinner. Not a single bite. Smart woman. Irene wove through the packed taproom, dodging the hands that tried to grab her. Halfway through her trek, she caught Nolan's eye from where he sat by the front door, an encouraging nod, his mostly bald head gleaming in the dim light. Keep her drinking, keep her buying. Irene avoided rolling her eyes, if only because Nolan was the sole reason she wasn't walking the cobblestone streets with the other young women of Inish. A year ago, the stout man had let her convince him that he needed more help in the tavern below the inn. Of course, he'd only accepted when he realized he'd be receiving the better end of the bargain. But she'd been 18 and desperate, and had gladly taken a job that offered only a few coppers and a miserable little bed in a broom closet beneath the stairs. Most of her money came from tips, but Nolan claimed half of them. And then Jessa, the other barmaid, usually claimed 2/3 of what remained because, as Jessa often said, she was the pretty face that gets the men to part with their money anyway. One glance into a corner revealed that pretty face and its attendant body perched on the lap of a bearded sailor, giggling and tossing her thick brown curls. Irene sighed through her nose but didn't complain, because Jessa was Nolan's favorite, and Irene had nowhere, absolutely nowhere, left to go. Inish was her home now, and the White Pig was her haven. Outside of it, the world was too big, too full of splintered dreams and armies that had crushed and burned everything Irene held dear. Irene at last reached the stranger's table and found the young woman looking up at her. "I brought you some water and bread, too," Irene stammered by way of greeting. She set down the ale, but hesitated with the other 2 items on her tray. The young woman just said thank you. Her voice was low and cool, cultured, educated, and completely uninterested in Irene. Not that there was anything about her that was remotely interesting, with her homespun wool dress doing little for her too slim figure. Like most who hailed from southern Fenharrow, Irene had golden tan skin and absolutely ordinary brown hair, and was of average height. Only her eyes, a bright gold brown, gave her any source of pride, not that most people saw them. Irene did her best to keep her eyes down most of the time, avoiding any invitation for communication or the wrong kind of attention. So Irene set down the bread and water and took the empty mug from where the girl had pushed it to the center of the table. But curiosity won out, and she peered into the black depths beneath the young woman's cowl. Nothing but shadows, a gleam of gold hair, and a hint of pale skin. She had so many questions. So many questions. Who are you? Where do you come from? Where are you going? Can you use all those blades you carry? Nolan was watching the entire encounter. So Irene curtsied and walked back to the bar through the field of groping hands, eyes downcast as she plastered a distant smile on her face. Celaena Sardothian sat at her table in the absolutely worthless inn, wondering how her life had gone to hell so quickly. She hated Inish, hated the reek of trash and filth, hated the heavy blanket of mist that shrouded it day and night, hated the second-rate merchants and mercenaries and generally miserable people who occupied it. No one here knew who she was or why she'd come. No one knew that the girl beneath the hood was Celaena Sardothian, the most notorious assassin in Adarlan's empire. But then again, she didn't want them to know. Couldn't let them know, actually, and didn't want them knowing that she was just over a week away from turning 17, either. She'd been here for 2 days now. 2 days spent either holed up in her despicable room, a suite the oily innkeeper had the nerve to call it, or down here in the tap room that stank of sweat, stale air, and unwashed bodies. She would have left if she'd had any choice, but she was forced to be here thanks to her master, Arobynn Hamel, king of the assassins. She'd always been proud of her status as his chosen heir, always flaunted it. But now, this journey was her punishment for destroying his atrocious slave trade agreement with the pirate lord of Skulls Bay. So unless she wanted to risk the trek through the Bogdano jungle, the feral bit of land that bridged the continent to the deserted land, sailing across the Gulf of Oro was the only way. Which meant waiting here, in this dump of a tavern, for a ship to take her to Yurpa. Celaena sighed and took a long drink of her ale. She almost spat it out. Disgusting. Cheap as cheap could be, like the rest of the place, like the stew she hadn't touched. Whatever meat was in there wasn't from any creature worth eating. Bread and mild cheese it was, then. Celaena sat back in her seat, watching the barmaid with the brown gold hair slip through the labyrinth of tables and chairs. The girl nimbly dodged the men who groped her, all without disturbing the tray she carried over her shoulder. What a waste of swift feet, good balance, and intelligent, stunning eyes. The girl wasn't dumb. Celaena had noted the way she watched the room and its patrons, the way she watched Celaena herself. What personal hell had driven her to work here? Celaena didn't particularly care. The questions were mostly to drive the boredom away. She'd already devoured the 3 books she'd carried with her from Rifthold, and not one of the shops in Inish had a single book for sale. Only spices, fish, out-of-fashion clothing, and nautical gear. For a port town, it was pathetic. But the kingdom of Melisande had fallen on hard times in the past 8.5 years, since the king of Adarlan had conquered the continent and redirected trade through Elwë instead of Melisandre's few eastern ports. The whole world had fallen on hard times, it seemed, Celaena included. She fought the urge to touch her face. The swelling from the beating Arobynn had given her had gone down, but the bruises remained. She avoided looking in the silver mirror above her dresser, knowing what she'd see. Mottled purple and blue and yellow along her cheekbones, a vicious black eye, and a still healing split lip. It was all a reminder of what Arobynn had done the day she returned from Skulls Bay. proof of how she betrayed him by saving 200 slaves from a terrible fate. She had made a powerful enemy of the pirate lord, and she was fairly certain she'd ruined her relationship with Arobin. But she had been right. It was worth it. It would always be worth it, she told herself. Even if she was sometimes so angry that she couldn't think straight, even if she'd gotten into not one, not two, but 3 bar fights in the 2 weeks that she'd been traveling from Riftfold to the Red Desert. One of the brawls, at least, had been rightfully provoked. A man had cheated at a round of cards. But the other 2, there was no denying it. She'd merely been spoiling for a fight. No blades, no weapons, just fists and feet. Celaena supposed she should feel bad about it, about the broken noses and jaws, about the heaps of unconscious bodies in her wake, but she didn't. She couldn't bring herself to care, because those moments she spent brawling were the few moments she felt like herself again, when she felt like Adarlan's greatest assassin, Arobin Hamel's chosen heir. Even if her opponents were drunks and untrained fighters, even if she should know better. The barmaid reached the safety of the counter, and Celaena glanced about the room. The innkeeper was still watching her, as he had for the past 2 days, wondering how he could squeeze even more money out of her purse. There were several other men observing her too. Some she recognized from previous nights, while others were new faces that she quickly sized up. Was it fear or luck that had kept them away from her so far? She had made no secret of the fact that she carried money with her, and her clothes and weapons spoke volumes about her wealth too. The ruby brooch she wore practically begged for trouble. She wore it to invite trouble, actually. It was a gift from Arobin on her 16th birthday. She hoped someone would try to steal it. If they were good enough, she might just let them. So it was only a matter of time, really, before one of them tried to rob her. And before she decided she was bored of fighting only with fists and feet, she glanced at the sword by her side. It glinted in the tavern's dank light. But she would be leaving at dawn to sail to the deserted land, where she'd make the journey to the Red Desert to meet the mute master of assassins, with whom she was to train for a month as further punishment for her betrayal of Arobin. If she were being honest with herself, though, she'd started entertaining the thought of not going to the Red Desert. It was tempting. She could take a ship somewhere else, to the southern continent perhaps, and start a new life. She could leave behind Arobin, the Assassin's Guild, the city of Riftfold, and Adarlan's damned empire. There was little stopping her, save for feeling that Arobin would hunt her down no matter how far she went, and the fact that Sam, well, she didn't know what had happened to her fellow assassin that night. The world had gone to hell. But the lure of the unknown remained, the wild rage that begged her to cast off the last of Arobin's shackles and sail to a place where she could establish her own Assassin's Guild. It would be so, so easy. But even if she decided not to take the ship to Europa tomorrow, and instead took one bound for the southern continent, she was still left with another night in this awful inn. Another sleepless night where she could only hear the roar of anger in her blood as it thrashed inside her. If she were smart, if she were level-headed, she would avoid any confrontation tonight and leave Inish in peace, no matter where she went. But she wasn't feeling particularly smart or level-headed, certainly not once the hours passed and the air in the inn shifted into a hungry wild thing that howled for blood. Chapter 2. Irene didn't know how or when it happened, but the atmosphere in the White Pig changed. It was as if all the gathered men were waiting for something. The girl at the back was still at her table, still brooding, but her gloved fingers were tapping on the scarred wooden surface, and every now and then she shifted her hooded head to look around the room. Irene couldn't have left even if she wanted to. Last call wasn't for another 40 minutes, and she'd have to stay an hour after that to clean up and usher intoxicated patrons out the door. She didn't care where they went once they passed the threshold, didn't care if they wound up face down in a watery ditch, just as long as they got out of the tap room and stayed gone. Nolan had vanished moments ago, either to save his own hide or to do some dark dealings in the back alley, and Jessa was still in that sailor's lap, flirting away, unaware of the shift in the air. Irene kept looking at the hooded girl. So did many of the tavern's patrons. Were they waiting for her to get up? There were some thieves that she recognized, thieves who had been circling like vultures for the past 2 days, trying to figure out whether the strange girl could use the weapons she carried. It was common knowledge that she was leaving tomorrow at dawn. If they wanted her money, jewelry, weapons, or something far darker, tonight would be their last chance. Irene chewed on her lip as she poured a round of ales for the table of 4 mercenaries playing kings. She should warn the girl, tell her that she might be better off sneaking to her ship right now before she wound up with a slit throat. But Nolan would throw Irene out into the streets if he knew she had warned her, especially when many of the cutthroats were beloved patrons who often shared their ill-gained profits with him. And she had no doubt that he'd send those very men after her if she betrayed him. How had she become so adjusted to these people? When had Nolan and the White Pig become a place and position she wanted so desperately to keep? Irene swallowed hard, pouring another mug of ale. Her mother wouldn't have hesitated to warn the girl. But her mother had been a good woman, a woman who never wavered, who never turned away a sick or wounded person, no matter how poor, from the door of their cottage in southern Fenharrow. Never. As a prodigiously gifted healer, blessed with no small amount of magic, her mother had always said it wasn't right to charge people for what she'd been given for free by Silba, the goddess of healing. And the only time she'd seen her mother falter was the day the soldiers from Adarlan surrounded their house, armed to the teeth and bearing torches and wood. They hadn't bothered to listen when her mother explained that her power, like Irene's, had already disappeared months before, along with the rest of the magic in the land, abandoned by the gods, her mother had claimed. No, the soldiers hadn't listened at all, and neither had any of those vanished gods to whom her mother and Irene had pleaded for salvation. It was the first and only time her mother took a life. Irene could still see the glint of the hidden dagger in her mother's hand, still feel the blood of that soldier on her bare feet, hear her mother scream at her to run, smell the smoke of the bonfires they burned her gifted mother alive, while Irene wept from the nearby safety of Oakwald Forest. It was from her mother that Irene had inherited her iron stomach, but she never thought those solid nerves would wind up keeping her here, claiming this hovel as her home. Irene was so lost in thought and memory that she didn't notice the man until a broad hand was wrapped around her waist. "We could use a pretty face at this table," he said, grinning up at her with a wolf smile. Irene stepped back, but he held firm, trying to yank her into his lap. "I've work to do," she said as blandly as possible. She detangled herself from situations like this before, countless times now. It had stopped scaring her long ago. "You can go to work on me," said another of the mercenaries, a tall man with a worn-looking blade strapped to his back. Calmly, she pried the first mercenary's fingers off her waist. "Last call is in 40 minutes, she said pleasantly, stepping back, as far as she could without irritating the men grinning at her like wild dogs. "Can I get you anything else?" "What are you doing after?" said another. "Going home to my husband," she lied. But they looked at the ring on her finger, the ring that now passed for a wedding band. It had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother and all the great women before her, all such brilliant healers, all wiped from living memory. The men scowled, and taking that as a cue to leave, Irene hurried back to the bar. She didn't warn the girl, didn't make the trek across the too big tap room with all those men waiting like wolves. 40 minutes, just another 40 minutes until she could kick them all out, and then she could clean up and tumble into bed, one more day finished in this living hell that had somehow become her future. Honestly, Selena was a little insulted when none of the men in the tap room made a grab for her money, her ruby brooch, or her weapons as she stalked between the tables. The bell had just finished ringing for last call, and even though she wasn't tired in the slightest, she'd had enough of waiting for a fight or a conversation or anything to occupy her time. She supposed she could go back to her room and reread one of the books she'd brought. As she prowled past the bar, flipping a silver coin to the dark-haired servant girl, she debated the merits of instead going out onto the streets and seeing what adventure found her. Reckless and stupid, Sam would say. But Sam wasn't here, and she didn't know if he was dead or alive or beaten senseless by Arobin. It was a safe bet Sam had been punished for the role he'd played in liberating the slaves in Skulls Bay. She didn't want to think about it. Sam had become her friend, she supposed. She never had the luxury of friends and never particularly wanted any, but Sam had been a good contender. Even if he didn't hesitate to say exactly what he thought about her, or her plans, or her abilities. What would he think if she just sailed off into the unknown and never went to the Red Desert, or never even returned to Rifthold? He might celebrate, especially if Arobynn appointed him as his heir. Or she could poach him, maybe. He suggested that they try to run away when they were in Skulls Bay, actually. So once she was settled someplace, once she had established a new life as a top assassin in whatever land she made her home, she could ask him to join her. And they never put up with beatings and humiliations again. Such an easy, inviting idea. Such a temptation. Celaena trudged up the narrow stairs, listening for any thieves or cutthroats that might be waiting. To her disappointment, the upstairs hall was dark and quiet and empty. Sighing, she slipped into her room and bolted the door. After a moment, she shoved the ancient chest of drawers in front of it, too. Not for her own safety. Oh, no. It was for the safety of whatever fool tried to break in, and would then find himself split open from navel to nose just to satisfy a wandering assassin's boredom. But after pacing for 15 minutes, she pushed aside the furniture and left, looking for a fight, for an adventure, for anything to take her mind off the bruises on her face and the punishment Arobynn had given her, and the temptation to shirk her obligations and instead sail to a land far, far away. Irene lugged the last of the rubbish pails into the misty alley behind the White Pig, her back and arms aching. Today had been longer than most. There hadn't been a fight, thank the gods, but Irene still couldn't shake her nerves and that sense of something being off. But she was glad, so glad, there hadn't been a brawl at the Pig. The last thing she wanted to do was spend the rest of the night mopping blood and vomit off the floor and hauling broken furniture into the alley. After she'd rung the last call bell, the men had finished their drinks, grumbling and laughing, and dispersed with little to no harassment. Unsurprisingly, Jessa had vanished with her sailor, and given that the alley was empty, Irene could only assume the young woman had gone elsewhere with him, leaving her, yet again, to clean up. Irene paused as she dumped the less disgusting rubbish into a neat pile along the far wall. It wasn't much. Stale bread and stew that would be gone by morning, snatched up by the half-feral urchins roaming the streets. What would her mother say if she knew what had become of her daughter? Irene had been only 11 when those soldiers burned her mother for her magic. For the first 6.5 years after the horrors of that day, she lived with her mother's cousin in another village in Fenharrow, pretending to be an absolutely ungifted, distant relative. It wasn't a hard disguise to maintain. Her powers truly had vanished. But in those days, fear had run rampant, and neighbor had turned on neighbor, often selling out anyone formerly blessed with the god's powers to whatever army legion was closest. Thankfully, no one had questioned Irene's small presence, and in those long years, no one looked her way as she helped the family farm struggle to return to normal in the wake of Adarlan's forces. But she'd wanted to be a healer, like her mother and grandmother. She'd started shadowing her mother as soon as she could talk, learning slowly, as all the traditional healers did. And those years on that farm, however peaceful, if tedious and dull, hadn't been enough to make her forget 11 years of training or the urge to follow in her mother's footsteps. She hadn't been close to her cousins, despite their charity, and neither party had really tried to bridge the gap caused by distance and fear and war. So no one objected when she took whatever money she'd saved up and walked off the farm a few months before her 18th birthday. She'd set out for Antica, a city of learning on the southern continent, a realm untouched by Adarlan and war, where rumor claimed magic still existed. She traveled on foot from Fenharrow across the mountains until Melisande, through Oakwald, eventually winding up at Inish, where rumor also claimed one could find a boat to the southern continent, to Antica. And it was precisely here that she'd run out of money. It was why she'd taken the job at the Pig. First, it had just been temporary, to earn enough to afford the passage to Antica, but then she'd worried she wouldn't have any money when she arrived, and then that she wouldn't have any money to pay for her training at the Torres Esme, the great academy of healers and physicians. So she'd stayed, and weeks had turned into months. Somehow, the dream of sailing away, of attending the Torre, had been set aside, especially as Nolan increased the rent on her room and the cost of her food and found ways to lower her salary, especially as that healer's stomach of hers allowed her to endure the indignities and darkness of this place. Irene sighed through her nose. So here she was, a barmaid in a backwater town with hardly 2 coppers to her name and no future in sight. There was a crunch of boots on stone, and Irene glared down the alley. If Nolan caught the urchins eating his food, however stale and disgusting, he'd blame her. He'd say he wasn't a charity and take the cost out of her paycheck. He'd done it once before, and she'd had to hunt down the urchins and scold them, make them understand that they had to wait until the middle of the night to get the food she so carefully laid out. "I told you to wait until it's past," she started, but paused as 4 figures stepped from the mist. Men, the mercenaries from before. Irene was moving for the open doorway in a heartbeat, but they were fast. Faster. One blocked the door while another came up behind her, grabbing her tight and pulling her against his massive body. "Scream, and I'll slit your throat," he whispered in her ear, his breath hot and reeking of ale. "Saw you making some hefty tips tonight, girl. Where are they?" Irene didn't know what she would have done next, fought or cried or begged or actually tried to scream. But she didn't have to decide. The man farthest from them was yanked into the mist with a strangled cry. The mercenary holding her whirled toward him, dragging Irene along. There was a ruffle of clothing, then a thump, then silence. "Then?" the man blocking the door called. Nothing. The third mercenary, standing between Irene and the mist, drew his short sword. Irene didn't have time to cry out in surprise or warning as a dark figure slipped from the mist and grabbed him. Not in front, but from the side, as if they just appeared out of thin air. The mercenary threw Irene to the ground and drew the sword from across his back, a broad, wicked-looking blade, but his companion didn't even shout. More silence. "Come out, you bleeding coward," the ringleader growled. "Faces like a proper man." A low, soft laugh. Irene's blood went cold. Silba, protect her. She knew that laugh, knew the cool, cultured voice that went with it. Just like how you proper men surrounded a defenseless girl in an alley. With that, the stranger stepped from the mist. She had 2 long daggers in her hands, and both blades were dark with dripping blood. Okay guys, that's the end of chapter 2 for the assassin and the healer. Thanks for listening.